Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Prime Minister Netanyahu is looking to shore up stocks of coronavirus vaccines amidst growing fears that vaccinations just will not last long enough. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister's generosity to other countries frozen by Israel's Attorney General, Mandelblit questioning the legality of the deals. And finally, ancient discoveries in Jerusalem proving that killing time is as old as time itself. Stay tuned for the story. We begin tonight again with the coronavirus. Authorities voting to reopen even more of the economy by next week, including additional perks for the vaccinated. The coronavirus cabinet agreeing Monday night to reopen yet another sector of the economy. The outline for one, allowing cafes and restaurants to reopen to all patrons outdoors. But for Green Pass holders or those who've been vaccinated or have recovered from COVID-19, they get a little bit more. They'll be able to dine indoors as well, while also having access to event halls, hotels, conferences, tourist attractions, and more. Meanwhile, schools grades 7 through 10 are also set to return to in-person learning in low infection or high vaccination communities. This as over 4.7 million Israelis have now vaccinated with the first dose, over 3.4 million having gotten both doses. Still, a little more work and uncertainty about the pandemic remains. So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announcing plans to purchase an additional 36 million vaccine doses just in case.
החיסונים שיש לנו, אף אחד לא יודע את תוקף עמידתם. אנחנו רשמנו בדרכון הירוק חצי שנה, אבל אולי זה שנה, אנחנו מקווים שיותר. אנחנו צריכים להיערך לתרחיש הגרוע. התרחיש הגרוע אומר שנצטרך לחסן כל חצי שנה 9 מיליון אזרחים בשני חיסונים.
As it is, though, participation in Israel's hallmark vaccine program is plateauing, and behind the numbers authorities had hoped for to fully reopen the country. Netanyahu then addressing the ongoing surge in morbidity from the virus, particularly among the Arab Israeli population, all while condemning misinformation campaigns and begging all Israelis from every demographic to vaccinate.
יש fake news אדיר. אנחנו מכניסים גוף זר החיסון זה גוף זר שפולש לגוף. מה פתאום? הגוף זר שפולש לגוף זה הנגיף, הקורונה. ואלמלא החיסונים, אנשים ימותו. לפני שהיה עידן החיסונים, אנשים מתו בהמוניהם, והגיל הממוצע, תוחלת החיים הממוצעת בעולם הייתה בין 30 ל-40. היום זה כפליים מזה, בגלל החיסונים. יש לנו חיסון לכל אזרח ואזרחית בישראל, לכולם, בלי יוצא מן הכלל. אין לנו שום הגבלה. בישראל החיסונים מחכים לאנשים. אז אני מבקש מכם, תתגייסו, אני מבקש שיסבירו את זה בעברית, בערבית, בכל דרך, לציבור, לכל הציבור, לציבור המוסלמי והנוצרי והבדואי והצ'רקסי והדרוזי, כולם צריכים להבין את זה. כי אין כאן, הנגיף לא מבחין בינינו, לא מבחין בין אף אחד מאיתנו.
Currently, the spread rate still holding above 5%. Active cases of coronavirus numbering around 39,200, of whom 729 are in serious condition, and the death toll rising overnight by 18 to 5,779. Now, in addition to reopening parts of the economy for Green Pass holders, Israel's coronavirus cabinet meeting is today discussing lifting the ban on entry from abroad. Ministers pushing to gradually reopen Ben Gurion Airport after 5 weeks of closures and ahead of national elections at the end of the month. This way, as many Israelis as possible would be able to return in time to vote March 23. As for the 2-week quarantine, a new pilot program beginning this week, offering returning Israelis a chance to isolate at home as opposed to inside state-run COVID hotels. Israelis can now choose instead to voluntarily wear a bracelet monitor that will notify authorities if wearers violate isolation. The bracelet hooking up to a smartphone and wall-mounted tracker installed in the home. And already, many Israelis are getting psyched by the idea.
I'm the first Israeli to receive this bracelet. I thought that I'm going to be in the hotel for the next 2 weeks, but I had the possibility to be at my home, isolated at my home, and I think that's a very nice idea.
The new electronic bracelet, it's it's good news for the passengers. I think most of them will choose to take the electronic bracelet instead of going to the hotel. They're going to stay at home for 10 or 14 days. It's going to open the skies.
אמרנו בחדשות שיש את הניסוי הזה, ואז אמרנו שאנחנו רוצים, ונתנו לנו את האפשרות, אז זה מעולה לנו, שלא נלך למלונית, אלא שנוכל לעשות את הבידוד בבית כמו שצריך.
Moving on, big news in Jerusalem as Attorney General Mandelblit officially blocks plans to donate coronavirus vaccines to friendly countries. Mandelblit essentially telling Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he's acting just a little too freely with the public's money. Hannah Rifkin with the report.
Some 21,000 doses of coronavirus vaccines already shipped from Israel to Honduras and Guatemala. This as part of a larger plan to donate roughly 100,000 vials of Israeli-purchased vaccines to 15 Israeli allies around the world. But Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit now putting a freeze on the move, saying he was not asked about the legality of the decision until after thousands of doses were sent out. Additionally, he's questioning the legality of the move as Netanyahu made the decision without ministerial approval and without filing necessary details, like the plan's objectives, compensation given or promised, officials involved, and more. So Mandelblit going on to rule that any future transfers of vaccines to another country must first be agreed upon in the cabinet, or at least another similar body. Now, meanwhile, as legal authorities fight back and forth, health officials are issuing concerns. Health Ministry Director General Chazi Levy suggesting Tuesday that a fourth lockdown is still on the table, adding that the government's decisions are all being tainted and influenced by the panic over coming national elections. Ballots are opening March 23rd for the fourth time in 2 years.
In other news, a landmark new ruling sending shockwaves through the religious authorities in Israel. In spite of long-standing objections from the rabbinate and other Orthodox bodies, the High Court of Justice has decided to legitimize all non-Orthodox conversions to Judaism for the purposes of citizenship or making aliyah. This as long as the conversion was performed in Israel. And joining me now with more is Chair of the Knesset Subcommittee on Israel Diaspora Relations, Knesset member Michal Kotler-Wunsch. Knesset member, it's such a pleasure to have you with us again. Now, this ruling is for Israel to recognize Reform and conservative conversions. It's a big deal, but it does not apply to Jews who converted outside of Israel. Why was this ruling separated from the recognition of non-Orthodox conversions in the diaspora?
So you're 100% right. And in fact, it's far less dramatic than what it's being perceived as over the last 24 hours or so, because it is 20 years since the recognition of non-Orthodox conversions for the purposes of immigration under the law of return, when those non-Orthodox conversions were being conducted in the United States or elsewhere. In fact, what this decision did after, and I should say this, 15 years of giving the executive and the legislative branches of government in Israel to actually mend this and find agreeable solutions to a real challenge. After 15 years, the court did, in fact, make an equal sort of granting of permission for those non-Orthodox conversions, again, for the purposes of immigration under the law of return. So the implications of this are that we've saved an airline ticket for those that may have traveled to the United States, let's say, for a reform or conservative conversion in the past. But in fact, it's far less dramatic than what has sort of made waves as far as the ultra-Orthodox parties and their reaction.
Well, so that being said, I mean, there are fears that this ruling will dilute what it means to be a Jew by making conversions easier. Does that have anything to do with it then, about why there was so much opposition to this change? Why is there so much pushback to this if, as you say, it's really just leveling the playing field with conversions abroad?
Right. So you're right that there has been very significant pushback. And I believe that the reason for that pushback is that it has actually engaged in a discussion that we should be having and are not having. And we should mention, and I said 15 years standing and awaiting this decision, but also the committees that were formed and rendered their recommendations, whether it's the Nisim committee or before that, years ago, the Ne'eman committee. And in fact, the Nisim committee most recently recommended that there be a national conversion authority that is widely accessible, that uses the local rabbinates, the municipal rabbis in the conversion processes, that creates a more, I would say, Beit Hillel, not that it's lenient in terms of its orthodoxy, but is much more welcoming And we should be aware that there is a festering challenge in the state of Israel. There are, and the numbers are unclear if it's 400 to 500,000 people today living in Israel that are not considered Jews, that are serving in the army, that are attending schools, that are attending universities, that are working alongside Jews. And many people don't understand that there is this festering problem that we need to, in terms of the legislative branch and the executive branch, not only talk about, but take responsibility for. And in that case, in this sense, the court has stepped in and stepped up, not because it is an activist court, but because the legislative and the executive branches have failed to do their job.
All right. Member of Knesset, Michal Kotler-Wunsch, thank you so much for being with us again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Moving along, Iran continuing to lash out in the region, repeating on Monday that if the United States wants to hold talks with Tehran, then it must lift its sanctions on Iran first. The Biden administration, meanwhile, still hinting at its willingness to return to the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal, but refusing to act first, saying that Iran must instead come back to compliance with the deal before the United States changes course. Both Tehran and Washington in a stalemate then. Iran's foreign minister, Saeed Khatibzadeh, lamenting the United States' choice to continue down the, quote, wrong path.
ما هیچ گفتگوی دو جانبه‌ای با ایالات متحده نداریم و تا موقعی که ایالات متحده مسیر غلط خودش رو اصلاح نکنه هیچ تغییری در سیاست‌های ایران صورت نخواهد گرفت. ببینید تا امروز که نزدیک به 2 ماه از دولت جدید آقای بایدن گذشته، حتی دولت آقای بایدن رسما بازگشت خودش رو به تعهد داد، حتی در کلام ما اعلام نکرد.
And all this while Iran is still maintaining that military nuclear breakthrough has never been their intended goal. Now, on a related note, Iran is still denying any connection to the recent blast reported on an Israeli vessel in the Gulf of Oman last weekend. But Israeli and international investigators still appear certain that Iran is behind the explosive mine attack. And to make matters worse, analysts are alleging that this attack proves that Israel's weaknesses at sea have been exposed. But here with more is Israeli security analyst Ari Kraus. Ari, thanks so much for being with us. Now, has Israel's vulnerability on the sea been discovered? What do we know as of now about this attack?
Hi, first, thanks for having me. I don't think it's fair to say that a particular vulnerability has been discovered in relation to Israeli maritime traffic. What we have to remember is that this attack targeted a ship that was very loosely associated with it. It's owned by a company based in Tel Aviv, but it wasn't flying an Israeli flag. It didn't have any other relationship with Israel. So had this targeted, let's say, an Israeli flag commercial vessel or an Israeli civilian vessel, I think that would be a little bit more concerning. But I don't think this represents a new or unique threat to Israeli shipping in the region.
So is there any chance that we're wrong that Iran is behind this?
Well, there's always the chance to be wrong, but I think that in this particular case, the proximity of the incident to Iranian waters and also the modus operandi was very specifically points to Iran. If people remember, I know now that they're talking before they thought it was a missile. Now defense officials are saying there might have been limpet mines that were planted by a naval commando force. These are all professional operations carried out by military forces or paramilitary forces that know how to undertake these operations. And it's the way in which the attack was calibrated to damage the ship, but not sink it, not harm anyone, I think points to a very calibrated professional attack, which points to Iran.
All right, so again, is there a chance that this will happen more often, especially since we will be in Gulf waters and airspace more openly now?
I think that there is a chance that similar attacks like this could happen, or as we go up the ladder of escalation, attacks on Israeli flagged vessels could occur. If we go back to 2019, 2 attacks were also attributed to Iran but never confirmed on oil tankers. This was only was ceased after an international coalition of like the United States and the United Kingdom came out against these attacks. So I think we have a chance to see similar attacks repeat themselves, especially as Iran is trying to pull certain levers or execute some sort of influence in the background of the American administration trying to bring them into the nuclear deal again.
All right, security analyst Ari Kraus, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and have a good day.
Now, in other news, the Middle East is still reaping the fruits of the historic Abraham Accords. The first ever ambassador to Israel from the United Arab Emirates arriving in Israel on Monday. Following formalized ties between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, UAE Ambassador Mohammed Al-Khaja reportedly out and about on the streets scouting a location for an embassy in Tel Aviv. And this after a meeting with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi, and after presenting his credentials to Israeli President Reuven Rivlin earlier in the day. Al-Khaja, Rivlin, and Ashkenazi, meanwhile, all celebrating the future to come.
I'm very proud and honored to be the first Emirati ambassador to State of Israel. I'm looking forward to meeting the President to provide my credence. His Highness Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, our Foreign Minister, sends his best regards. And we are very much looking forward to working together. My mission here is to foster and develop this relationship.
Additionally, Ashkenazi and Khaja pledging to build new bilateral relations and strategy for dealing with the looming threats from Iran. Ashkenazi announcing plans to develop a strategic regional defense pact with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and other both regional and Western powers. And now back in COVID-related news now, we're over a year into the pandemic, and an interesting phenomenon has been gaining in popularity. As more and more companies send their employees to work from home, employees are taking their home jobs on the road and traveling abroad, often without their employers even knowing. But of course, as you might imagine, complications can and do arise with such an arrangement. And that's when you need to turn to Self-Relo for help. Tzvi Kantor, co-founder and CEO of Self-Relo, spoke to us earlier in the studio today. Let's take a look. I have to ask you my first question, what is the phenomenon behind self-relocation?
The phenomena is when individuals, employees, decided to relocate themselves to another and work instead of from home to work from another country.
How often does this happen?
Recently, as of the corona started, it happened quite often. When people are being told by their employers to go and work from home, they decided to go to either to Texas or to Israel and work from their parents' home or from their friends, or boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, or to work from Thailand or the Caribbean.
I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you can, why not work from the Caribbean? I think a lot of people would do that. So what services does Self-Relo really provide for these employees and for their employers?
Three kinds of services. The first one is to have a corporate policy, because since the phenomena was quite rare beforehand, there was in most companies there was no written corporate policy about it. What do you do when you are requested to work from distance? What you can and what you cannot do. So first of all, the company has to look inside and decide about their policy. The second type of services are crisis management. When the company found that one of the female employees in Paris, hospitalized in Paris due to car accident, and apparently was also pregnant, and they don't have any, they never knew that she's in Paris. They thought she's in Givatayim. And what do you do now? What next?
So what do you do now? I mean, how does Self-Relo step in and solve a crisis?
This is exactly the third type of services, the coordination services. Crisis services is helping the usual team of the company, teaming up with them and helping them in whatever need they have in order to react to the crisis.
Speaking of crises, right, the COVID-19 crisis obviously jump-started or increased the number of people who have been working from home, and working abroad apparently might also be, as you're saying, a growing phenomenon. But do you see that phenomenon sticking around for the long term?
Yes, most definitely. Many companies have already publicly announced that people will be working from home until June this year. And many companies, depend on the sector and the other characteristic, have advised that 10 to 20% of their labor force will be allowed to work from home. if you know in advance that you will be allowed or able to work from distance throughout the next year, then you start thinking, why not taking advantage of that in order to travel? And another evidence to that is the fact that about almost 20 countries has special visa, self-sponsored visa for foreign experts that you can get in order to work in their countries without the need to be sponsored by your employer.
It's a pretty complicated thing to just pick up and move. It's not always that easy. But again, I just want to let everybody know, check out Self-Relo if you're thinking about working remotely, especially abroad from the company that you're working at. Zvi, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're very welcome.
Moving on, the incentives for getting vaccinated just keep on coming. Royal Caribbean International now planning to launch cruises departing from Israel. This means that all fully vaccinated or green pass carrying Israelis will be eligible to float away on the cruise of a lifetime. Meanwhile, to open on schedule, the company is working hard to follow health regulations, partnering with Israel's health and tourism authorities to ensure that both crew and guests above the age of 16 will be vaccinated against COVID-19. As for the cruises themselves, the 3 to 7 day trips are set to depart out of Haifa starting in May, taking passengers to Cyprus and Greece, both countries that signed tourism agreements in recent weeks with Israel to allow travel for the vaccinated. And the tickets are set to go on sale next week. Now, until flights, cruises, and other more social parts of the economy reopen, we're mostly just stuck in waiting. But there are tons of time-tested activities to do when you are in the in-between, and some even dating back thousands of years, as archaeologists in Israel just discovered. Alyssa Hugel with the story.
It's a story as old as human history itself. People finding themselves stuck, waiting around and coming up with fun games to play to pass the time. But from backgammon to Leo Bow to the royal game of dice have made a pretty consistent appearance in the games we play. And the Israel Antiquity Authority now finding the largest collection of ancient dice ever found in one place in all of Israel. The huge collection being discovered in Jerusalem by the Western Wall, and offering a glimpse into the daily life under ancient Roman rule.
Over the past few years, the Israel Antiquities Authority has been conducting an excavation underneath the Western Wall Prayer Plaza, funded by the Western Wall Heritage Foundation. And over the past few years, we've exposed a small theater-like structure, probably founded during the Roman period, after the destruction of the Jewish Jerusalem in 70 CE by the Roman legions. One of the finds with extreme interest were these 35 gaming dice. They look identical to modern gaming dice, and you could practically pick one of these dice up and use it today for any modern game that uses dice.
Of course, on top, exposing ancient Roman Israel pastimes. The discovery also exposing another equally human trait, trying to cheat.
An extremely interesting die is this one here. If all the dice usually have 6 numbers, 1 on each side, this one has a 1, a 2, no 3, and 2 4s. Apparently, whoever owned this die preferred to have 2 4s and no 3. Maybe he was playing some sort of game that had some sort of preference for either an equal result or a higher result, and he thought he would be able to pull off this little cheat over here.
And now let's take a look at the weather forecast with Hannah Rifkin.
Tonight's lows will lay at about 47 degrees Fahrenheit or 8 degrees Celsius. And moving on to tomorrow's forecast, Israel expecting showers throughout most of the country, with highs averaging 62 degrees Fahrenheit or about 14 degrees Celsius.
Thank you, Hannah. Now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. If only I had a nickel for every time I wanted to do this with my own puppy. Mine's a little too big for this, though, now. So cute. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.3 shekels to the American dollar and 2.61 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.